Hey everybody, it's Scott from Oakridge Community Church with another edition of Life Minutes. Last week we began talking about principles for interpreting the Bible. And as I said last week, I'm not insinuating or indicating that you don't know how to study the Bible if you're watching this video. I just know how sometimes when we sit down to look at Scripture, sometimes it's not always easy to understand the text. It's not. I'm working on a series I'll be doing at Oakridge on the book of Hebrews, and there are some challenging passages in Hebrews that have been interpreted in a couple of different ways by those who have studied the book. And so I have to go back and ask myself certain questions as I'm studying so that I can, to the best of my ability, get an understanding of what is being said. So today we're going to look at three principles of what we call biblical interpretation. These are just things to keep in mind if you sit down to study a book of the Bible or a certain passage, and as you go through, you'll want to just keep some things in mind. The first is this, that every book of the Bible, every author had a reason for writing what they did. And it's important to know that because it leads us to ask certain questions, like who was the author and who was he writing to? And what are some of the key things that he's writing about and dealing with? And what's the cultural setting maybe behind the book or a certain passage in the book? For example, if you read Ephesians, Paul's writing to the church at Ephesus, and as you go through the book, you begin to see that there are certain things that he wants to make sure that the readers understand, like regarding their relationship with Christ and how that then is to form how they live. And so Ephesians is a book that is a good book to use principles like this on to help us get a background to what the author's trying to say. And there are good tools out there that can help us to get information about what we are studying. For example, there are a number of commentaries written by individuals on each individual book of the Bible, but there are also commentaries, 1 and 2 volume commentaries that can give you information about the book, who the author was, maybe who he was writing to. This is called the Biblical Expositor. There's 3 volumes to this set, and I don't even know if this is still available, but it's it's not as a detailed commentary as some others are, but it gives you some good overview of what the author is writing about. And then there are what are called surveys. This is a popular survey of the New Testament by Norman Geisler. He goes through each book in the New Testament. He talks about who the author is, why the book was written, who was it addressing, and things like that. And it's important to just have a little background to what we're studying when we dive into the Scriptures. One of the key things to keep in mind when you and I sit down to study the Bible is our goal, obviously, is to understand what it says, and we want to see how it applies to us. We must always remember that application must always follow interpretation. We have to let the Bible speak for itself, and then see how and if the passage we are studying applies to us today. Now, we have to be careful to not force an interpretation of a certain scripture just so we can make a point, okay? That's where we're reading into the Bible. Talked a little bit about that last week. So we have to understand that the authors had reasons behind why they wrote. A second thing to remember when we study the Bible is that context determines understanding. We mentioned last week that for the most part, all verses that you read are part of a greater section of Scripture. There are singular verses. We mentioned that last week, for example, in Proverbs. But we always have to remember context is crucial. So what do we mean by that? Well, if you were to do a study through the book of First John, you would discover that John lays out certain thoughts over 3 or 4 verses at a time, and he uses certain words and phrases, for example, in First John, to describe a person's relationship with God. Now, John wrote 5 books in the New Testament, and if as we're studying First John and we see John is using a word like truth, for example, and he talks about the truth being in us. If we go back and we see how John has used certain words in his other writings, we can begin to understand the context of what he's trying to say in his book, all right? Now, in some instances, a writer will use the same word in a different way than they had in a previous verse. Let me give you an example of this. In Matthew uses a Greek word that we translate into the English as saved, or to save someone. He uses it in 2 different ways in his gospel. He uses it to describe entering into a personal relationship with Christ, becoming a believer. So he uses the word save in that way, but he also uses the same Greek word in a different context to describe when the disciples were out on the boat and a storm arose on the Sea of Galilee. The disciples cried out to Christ, "Save us." Same Greek word, but in a different meaning. You have to understand the context of how words are used so that we can better understand the meaning behind what the writer is saying. So we said we have to keep in mind the context, the verses that surround a particular text we might be looking at. A good example of that is Revelation 3:20. The Bible tells us there, as Jesus is speaking to the church at Laodicea, that he says, I'm standing at the door and knocking. And if you'll answer, I will come in and I will eat with you and you with me. And often that verse has been used in the area of evangelism. The Lord's knocking on the door of your heart and he wants you to accept him into your life. But Revelation 3:20 can't be read by itself. In the context, Jesus is speaking to a church in the city of Laodicea. And I'll be honest with you, it's a messed up church. They're not living for God. Jesus says, you're nothing more than like lukewarm water. I want to spit you out of my mouth. When he says that, he is challenging the church at Laodicea to wake up. So when he comes to verse 20 and we read about him knocking on the door, he's getting the attention of the church at Laodicea. Stop being lukewarm. He says, I'd rather you be cold or hot, but this lukewarm approach to knowing me doesn't work. In the context, Revelation 3:20, though there may be no doubt unsaved people in the church of Laodicea, the context shows that verse 20 is not an evangelistic verse. So we have to study the Bible in its context, because that helps us to determine understanding. Seeing how authors may use certain words in other places of their writings, and seeing how a verse that we're studying lines up with the verses maybe before and after it, all will help us to properly interpret the scriptures. A third principle of interpretation is this. We need to allow the Bible to be interpreted literally, allowing, though, for figurative language. What do we mean? Often people read into the scriptures something. They read into them, as we said last week, a presupposition, or they read something and they try to spiritualize a particular thing. Years ago, I remember as a young Christian hearing a guy on the radio, and he was in one of the Gospels, and he started talking about how in this particular text where it talks about Jesus walking through the hills and being surrounded by the hills, he tried to spiritualize what the hills stood for. Instead of just recognizing that rolling hills are rolling hills, he tried to read into the Bible some spiritual meaning behind what the gospel was saying about the physical setting where Jesus was. That's a dangerous thing to do. When we do that, we then control the meaning of the text instead of allowing the Bible to teach us what it is saying. We're reading into it. So we have to allow the Bible as much as possible to be interpreted literally. We do know there's figurative language. In other words, Jesus spoke in parables. We know there's allegories. We know that there are certain figures of speech that we have to be aware of, and that's you can learn about all of that through books on how to interpret the Bible. It'll walk you through the different figures of speech that you find in Scripture. But let me give you an example of that. One writer, in talking about how we need to interpret the Bible literally, says, quote, for example, Isaiah 55:12 states, "The trees of the field will clap their hands." Since trees do not have hands or clap, he says this must be a figure of speech. And then he tells us something. Look for words such as like or as, which can also communicate a figure of speech. But as much as possible, allow the Bible to speak for itself. As I said, there is figurative language in certain places, but as much as possible, allow the Bible to interpret itself literally. So keep in mind, there was a reason the author wrote what he did. Allow the context to determine understanding and interpret the Bible literally, allowing for figurative language, but allow the scriptures to speak for itself. Hey, this is Scott at Oakridge Community Church. Join me next week for another action-packed look at principles for interpreting the Bible.